It's an adventure. All right. Good morning. I am hoping that this is all working. The Zoom, the Facebook Live, all the things. Welcome everyone to the first of the general election season of our Sunday morning candidate coffee and conversation Facebook Live events. We'll be here for about 30 minutes. I'm so glad to have anyone who's joining us be with us. These conversations will be available as recorded videos on the Elect Lori Trieger Facebook page and also on our YouTube channel. So if you're watching and you have friends you wish were here to hear this conversation, let them know they can check it out a little bit later. I am Lori Trieger, candidate for Lane County Commissioner, District 3 seat. And these candidate coffees on Facebook Live was a strategy that we pivoted to when COVID hit as a way to stay more connected to community, to hear from voters about the issues on their mind, and share a little bit about my experience and work in the community and what I want to do as your next county commissioner. And what we learned in doing these in the primary was 30 minutes was just about right. And that there were lots of issues on people's minds that we didn't get around to talking to in that cycle. And so we have another chance here. And one of those issues is housing. And I can tell you that before COVID hit, when I was able to go out knocking on folks' doors, I knocked over 2,000 doors. And without exception, almost every single person that I made contact with, when I would ask, what are the issues on your mind? What are the concerns that you see in the community that you want to see me work on? People brought up housing and or homelessness. Sometimes people brought them up together. Sometimes people said one or the other. But of course, they are intricately linked, as are all of the issues connected to housing and homelessness, including medical and mental health care services, access to transportation, the ability to have good, nutritious food available near where you live, good schools, and of course, a clean environment and good drinking water. All these things are intricately connected, and they all have to do with our ability to get or keep folks housed in our community. So I'm really excited today to have a conversation with someone who's working on all of these interconnected issues with housing at the center. And that is Heather Sielicki. So I'm going to introduce Heather in just a minute, and she's going to share a bit with you about her really impactful and creative work in our community on these issues. Before I introduce Heather, I want to mention that just this past Tuesday, our Board of County Commissioners heard a presentation on the county's first ever proposed housing action plan that a nonprofit organization, a collaborative effort called Better Housing Together, has been working on for a long time. Better Housing Together is an effort of more than 50 local organizations, local governments and jurisdictions, private nonprofits, and more. And so I would really encourage folks who want to do a little bit of a deeper dive and learn more about the content of this housing action plan to go to the county's website or to their YouTube page and watch that presentation to the commissioners. It was Tuesday, August 25th. It was their morning session. And it was a really interesting, informative, information-packed presentation on the state of housing in terms of affordability, land availability, number of units, and how housing affordability and incomes in our community intersect, and more. Lots of really important and good, clear information there to start laying the groundwork and the path forward for housing in our community with the county commissioners. So all that said, I want to introduce my guest and thank Heather for taking some time on a Sunday morning to join us. Heather, as a Human Rights Commissioner for City of Eugene and Operations Coordinator for Whitebird Clinic, is working independently also as a community volunteer on a whole systems approach to implementing housing and homelessness prevention strategies with a farm at the center, which I love because those of you that have been following me or know my history, working on food security and food sovereignty is just a central core value to me personally, to my professional life and my volunteer activism. So love that connection. Heather has served as the chair of the Southeast Neighbors for 4 years and is the co-chair as the co-chair of the Eugene Neighborhood Leadership Council for 2 years. She's been an active member of the Human Rights Commission Homelessness Working Group and the Neighborhood Leaders Council Housing and Homelessness Committee. And she's previously served on the Community Development Block Grant Advisory Board. She was recognized as a neighborhood disaster preparedness leader by the City of Eugene's Emergency Management Division and provided leadership and coordination towards the development of her neighborhood's disaster plan. She currently serves as secretary of the COAD, the Coalition of Organizations Active in Disaster Response. Heather coordinates district-wide meetings and events with parent-driven organizations and district leadership across School District 4J as well. So I see you've got a cup of coffee or tea. You need that to fuel all this great community work you're doing. Thank you so much, Heather, for being here. And I'm going to turn it over to you and have you share a little bit about what all of what I just introduced you as doing really means, what it looks like on the ground, and what you're up to. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. Yeah, I got started with this type of work not long after I moved here. I moved here in 2008 with a 1-year-old and got involved with my neighborhood association and SURT and the parent-teacher organization. And then one day I got a call from River Road Neighborhood Association, and he said, "You're it." And I said, "You're it? What do you mean?" He said, "The homeless campers have moved into your neighborhood association, and they're on a vacant parcel." And I hadn't really been paying attention to what had been going on. And sure enough, there was an encampment there, and I went out to meet with the folks, and I really opened my eyes to just how severe the lack of shelter and the housing crisis is here in Lane County. Just really surprising how many beds short we are going into a cold, rainy winter every year.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So can you share a little bit about this project that you're working on where we talk about, connecting food and the ability for folks to provide for their own food needs with housing and that coupling of needs?
Sure, absolutely. So, with really at this point in time, I think that especially with a problem like homelessness, it's not one problem, right? It's interconnected problems, and we're at a point in time where interconnected problems require interconnected solutions. So just addressing just the location issue is not enough. We've got 80% of our population unsheltered, and it's been challenging to cite locations for having people there. We need solutions now that are going to leverage the systems we have, because all of the providers are kind of at capacity, and non-congregate housing is really important right now with COVID, and it's a public health necessity. At the same time, we have to cite these developments and overcome objections from neighbors concerned about negative impacts. That's always been a part of this work. We have limitations with our zoning. In Eugene, 6 or 20 units are all that are allowed in the emergency shelter ordinance. And so what I'm working on is an approach that would maximize that 6 to 20 zoning requirement that when you were talking about homelessness, which is the importance of workforce development and being able to be connected, because just having some of these other needs met, if you don't have a place to work and sustain yourself, it's going to be really hard to get out of. So I'm putting together a shelter system model anchored around regenerative agriculture, biocycling, and art, with at the same time providing net plus environmental impacts. So there'll be hubs that are for work, communal work. Well, one that we're looking at right now is a farm parcel, agriculture, where we would have some farm worker housing, and there's gonna be one crop area. Then there's another one that is a mushroom farm, and that's in a temperature controlled environment. And people can go and work. They're also going to have the showers and the shared central services, and then there'll be a transportation system to get people from their spots to the farm. There's and it's also going to have uh, an entrepreneurial aspect. So it's not just that people will live in these rest stops, these 6 to 20 units. They'll also have a micro enterprise that's affiliated with whichever farm, whether it's the mushroom farm or the other agricultural plot.
Great. I love that. And I will just say on the technology side, just as an aside into our viewers, Heather and I, before we got on the call, we're sharing challenges of internet connectivity. And so apologies in advance if some of this video is a little skippy or freezing. We're doing our best. And if we do drop somehow connection, we will pick it right back up. So bear with us. Thanks for that. Heather, I love how you're talking about not just connecting food and housing, but people's own ability to grow their own food, but also that micro enterprise development piece. A project I worked on in the late 2000, in like 2012 or so was, I was the launch manager for a year at NEDCO of the Sprout Regional Food Hub, where it was exactly that sort of 360-degree supporting folks in developing a good, strong food-related business plan, providing a resource with a commercially certified and fully equipped kitchen for them to do their food production, and then even a place to sell that food with the Springfield Farmers Market, which several years before I helped to develop, and then the pop-up restaurants and so on in there. So who are some of the partners you're working with to make these projects happen? Particularly, I'm interested in the food micro enterprise development pieces.
Yeah, honestly, I wasn't prepared to talk about this today. We're a lot of what we're doing is still under wraps.
Fair.
So we're at the point now where we're working with investors and trying to collaborate with a variety of partners. We're not in the process of rolling it out.
Okay, that's great. It's great to know that it's happening. And so share with me a little more then. I'm really interested in two things you brought up. One, you talked about the challenges of siting, right? Like it's not just about finding the sites, but then even sometimes we do find sites for either intermediary or temporary shelter, or even encampments, or sites to build permanent housing. And there's a lot of pushback from immediate neighbors or local community. So I'd love to hear your thoughts a little bit about how, as a community, we can come together to address that and have those conversations. And the other, I'm going to share both topics so you can pick and choose how you answer. And the other, you mentioned COVID, of course, which has created an even greater sense of urgency of addressing folks' needs, but also an added complication to locating, to finding places to shelter folks who are currently unhoused safely.
Well, I don't know exactly. There's a lot of questions there.
Yeah, so the siting issue and working with community, and then the impacts of COVID on the work.
Okay, so first of all, we were going into this season with 4,000 people unsheltered, and we have not prepared and planned for where those people are going to be. We continue to criminalize the condition rather than create additional housing, and we don't provide enough support. So what's happening is more and more people are unsheltered. There's less beds than ever before. We're not investing in any kind of problem solving. And as a result, you're seeing more unsheltered people with addictions, people with mental illness, people who are untreated, because we're just not doing anything. So the neighborhoods, of course, are going to be concerned because they're not seeing a whole lot of wraparound supports around people. They're not seeing, we know how to fix the problem, but we're not addressing it at a scale or a scope that's sufficient to meet the need.
Yeah.
So COVID is coming. It's here, right? You look at what's happening in Anchorage or Seattle, the homeless shelters there are losing, lots of people are starting to get COVID, right? Well, we're 275 beds less than we had this time last year, right? And
Because of
you know,
the
this
COVID.
because we've had to reduce the shelter capacity due to COVID, right? Because of social distancing.
Yeah.
For a small period of time, we put some shelters up, and then we took those down. And you know, you hear a lot of people talk about what we should do, the weather strategies. I mean, neighborhood associations are concerned because they're seeing the government fail their citizens. Neighbors are losing their homes in their own neighborhood. Evictions are going to start at the end of September. And I mean, what we need to find places for people to be. We need to sufficiently support those places. And we know that a lot of people need permanent supported housing. In the meantime, they need some supported shelter, because some people wait for years before ever reaching that goal of getting housing. So we need to fund the programs that help people at the right amount, and then neighborhoods are going to be happy to have communities of support. Um, it's really important that we start to address the issues.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. Um, I'm just checking here to see if we have any Facebook comments or anything before we, just to make sure we leave time for all the things. I really appreciate you bringing local government into the conversation. Of course, as someone who's running for public office, this is exactly where I'm wanting to be effective and impactful. No one elected official, of course, can make systemic change on their own, but what I do see and feel a little bit of hope for on our county commission in particular, with a shift with some of those seats being held by new folks with new energy urgency, and in the case of Chair Buck, expertise in housing and understanding and relationships with folks in that sector. I see some potential for real opportunity that we haven't historically had at the county level. And of course, the county is the service provider. The county is our board of health, and housing is a public health issue. And the county is our housing authority with the Homes for Good agency. And so I do think we have some real opportunity, but we need bold leadership. And by bold, I mean people who are willing not just to sort of make a good or right vote when the time comes, but to really champion an issue and really bring it to the foreground at every opportunity, and create some really stronger connections with the partners that are required to make this work happen.
How are you going to do that?
I'm sorry?
How are you going to do that?
Yeah, well, one is just by being, as I said, insistent and on bringing the issue up all the time, right? I am going to, there's a small handful of issues that, again, they're what I hear on the door, so I know they're what voters care about, and that's our job as local government officials, is to serve our community. And if what the community is telling us they care about is housing affordability, services for folks who are unhoused, particularly around healthcare and mental health services, and mitigating for climate change, then those issues need to be at the top of our agenda at all of our meetings, at all of our budget allocation conversations. And the other thing that I will say to you, Heather, that I'm really committed to doing is, I think far too often the conversation starts and ends with money. And so I'm going to be really committed to having those conversations about what are the barriers to serving unhoused people in our community, particularly, that aren't money. Put the money aside for a minute and let's talk about the barriers that aren't the money. And then we'll have the money conversation later, because I think we're letting people off the hook from having honest conversations about what's getting in the way of providing these services to folks by saying we don't have the money. I'd love to hear your response to that.
Absolutely. I think it's really important that the city and county start to acknowledge some of the real issues and the insurmountable barriers to housing and employment creating by penalizing unhoused people with punitive measures. I mean, you say you want to support the TAC report. Well, as long as it's totally within the law to discriminate against people based on housing status, which it is here in Lane County, then how are we going to do that? If people say they're unhoused, well, we don't rent to unhoused people. I mean, we have to start dealing with that. We have to break this cycle where we're constantly falling short. A homeless bill of rights could be a way of doing that.
Yeah.
We're spending a great deal of money on criminal justice. And that's not an approach to deal with a lack of housing. People don't need services. They need housing. They need someplace where they can have privacy. They need someplace where they can stabilize. And we're looking at massive evictions. So there's going to be even more people, and they're going to find out that there are no solutions here, and that in fact that they will be they will enforce laws against them for their unhoused status rather than their behavior. And this is a sad relic from history with sundown laws and Jim Crow. And we have to deal with that, because if the city is going to be putting people in jail and make it so people can't get housing, how is the county going to house them? How are they going to deal with health and human services issues when they keep going in and out of jail and losing their OHP? I
Yes.
mean, your cross purposes, the city and the county.
Yes, I completely agree. I completely agree with everything you said, and that I'm glad you brought in that cycle of criminalizing homelessness, and then people end up having a record, and then they've been through a system that makes it then harder for them to get employed later, which
And
then
that's what creates the stigma. And then
yeah,
the stigma keeps going, and people think homelessness is an individual failure rather than a system failure. And
exactly.
it's a failure of our ability to keep up with the planning that was necessary. We didn't do it. We failed our community. We don't have 4,000 people unsheltered in other cities. This is for one our size,
Yeah,
one
right.
of the highest per capita in the country. And it's because we've created chronic homelessness, just like we're creating chronic addiction by continuing to penalize addiction. And that's why I'm a big fan of Measure 110, and saying that that could help to add more treatment, because people don't people want housing and they want treatment.
Yeah.
and,
Yes.
and then you don't have to spend so much money with attorneys and let the police officers work on public safety rather than people's status issues, which they have no control over.
That's right. I'm really glad you brought up, in the interest of time, I want to make sure if you want to say a little bit about that ballot measure, because I'm with you on that, and let folks who are watching this know about that. And then I do want to take a couple of minutes before we wrap up to talk about that issue of stigma. So share just a little bit about Measure 110.
Well, it's on the ballot for this fall, and what it would do is it doesn't legalize drugs, but it decriminalizes it so that it becomes less of an offense, and it also uses our marijuana tax revenue and puts that towards treatment, so that there's more access uh, to mental health and addiction treatment.
Yeah.
We're 50 out of 50 in terms of funding for mental health treatment now, so
Right.
this would put us on a better path.
And thank you for bringing that up. And that is a perfect example, as you say, of how we have created systems and structures that foster more people being unhoused rather than doing the humanitarian thing of providing housing and then the services that folks need to stay housed. I could not agree more. This is what, for over 20 years in this community, every organization I've worked for, all the initiatives I've worked on are exactly addressing these kind of systemic and structural issues to make it easier for folks. You know, we say people, you should make better choices. Well, we need to give people better options if we want them to take the responsibility for making good choices. And I think that's where, I think it's so important that you brought up the stigma issue. And one thing that that I think we're already seeing some of is people who this sort of othering, that someone who is unhoused or someone who has a mental health issue or addiction, special guest, that they are somehow different than the average person in Lane County, when in fact many more people struggle with these issues. Some people just have the luxury, the benefit, the privilege, and the opportunity to struggle more invisibly than others because of their housing status. And I think with COVID and the mass layoffs and reduction in hours and the attendant evictions that we're going to see, more and more people are going to start seeing themselves in these issues in ways they've always thought were some other people's problems. And I think that is going to help us go some way toward reducing stigma about who needs help and why, and where the solutions lie. And I really believe and have seen happen, solutions lie in cross-jurisdictional, public and private. The government plays a huge role, And yes, so does the private sector, but government can do a lot to remove barriers. If we're going to talk about low barrier shelter, we also have to have low barriers for service providers to provide those services, or for folks to build the housing. So so I couldn't agree more with all of what you just said. I think stigma is a big problem, and we do ourselves as a community no favors by continuing these laws that criminalize housing status. I'm also really glad you brought in the issues around race and ethnicity, and how racism contributes to these issues of criminalizing homelessness and treatment services and availability. I think that's so important. And if there's anything you want to add about that, but I appreciate you bringing that into the conversation.
Well, they did just do a study, and they found that 94% of the disparate policing around could be eliminated with this measure 110, because a lot people of color and people of Black are so much more targeted for crimes of any sort, really.
Was that a
So
local statistic or a national?
no, it's Oregon.
Oregon.
Yeah, it's in the yes for 110, I think is the website. But yeah, I mean, we need to find one of the things I'd like to see us do is, I mean, we need to have a better way to respond from being in the city for 30 days, or they go and have their car impounded. So there's just a lot of things that we do where it's complaint based, and we're not necessarily making sure that those complaints are the biggest concern in the issue.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And that all ties to, as I said, if we start a conversation with, can we afford it? Then we end the conversation before we even get to have it. And I think that's an example of some of the solutions and some of the answers which don't cost money, which is restructuring what we consider what level of crime and how we address it. And so I think really appreciate you bringing up that ballot measure. That is so important piece of restructuring criminal justice and decriminalizing, which also addresses some of the systemic racism at the root of our housing crisis, and also talking about one thing COVID has done is it's shown that when again, this goes back to stigma and people who've never had to address or think about these problems. When it starts to address the sort of more average homeowner person, we suddenly can figure out how to find a solution and find the money to go with it, right? So I think about an example is I've been talking for a year and a half as part of this campaign that telework options should be available for the county workforce as an equity measure, because people have caregiving responsibilities, find it easier to coordinate and manage if they have flexible work schedules and can telecommute. It's better for the environment not to have everybody having to travel to and from a work site. It makes us more resilient. We haven't even talked about your disaster preparedness work, but it makes us more resilient if there's a disaster and services are disrupted, that people can work from home. But there's been a lot of resistance to it institutionally. But then when COVID hit and sort of everybody needed to address it, suddenly we had, the majority of the county workforce within a matter of a couple of weeks with the equipment and the tools and the say-so from the organization to go ahead and do just that. So I think there's probably lots more that we could be doing, and that COVID is showing us we can actually implement a lot of changes that we know are needed, that we've been historically.
But it's also it's showing the opposite too, because like at Whitebird, 50% of our clients don't have access to telehealth equipment. They don't have phones. They don't have the ability to utilize these tools. So while there are services that definitely still exist on telehealth, they're not for all of us.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, we need to wrap up, but I think that's a great message to wrap up with, which is and again, I've been talking about this for a long time, is if we address first the needs of, if we think of our community as a circle, and we address the needs of the most marginalized, the people on the edges of that circle first, all of us are caught up in those solutions. But if we start here, we just keep leaving these folks out. And that becomes very expensive. It becomes untenable. And it really is just, an issue of a humanitarian crisis that we're creating. As you say, this is of our own creation. And if we can create it, we can address it, and we can fix it, and we can make it better. But it takes persistence and insistence and partnership and creativity. And yeah, it takes money. It does take money, but we have money. It's a matter of what are we spending it on that continuum, right? And so if we could put a little more money into some structural changes and some preventive measures, it would save us from spending on some of the most expensive services down the line.
It'll be even
in jail for a night is a lot more expensive than housing someone.
Right. And that's like the main key is we have to do it together. The CDC says the only way we're going to address COVID is by having collaborative efforts. Not about throwing money at the problem. It's about making sure that we have the capacity as a system to be able to implement the solutions that are being recommended, and working together across all the different lines, nonprofit, government, faith community. We all have to work together in this. We need the businesses. It's going to be a community-wide effort.
Yeah, that's a great message to end on. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Heather. Thank you for all of your advocacy and your work in the community. I am so looking forward to working with you, hopefully from a seat where I have a little more influence and opportunity to help us move together on this issue towards solutions. And just very much appreciate all of your work, and particularly because I know you're working so hard, I appreciate you taking some time on a Sunday morning to talk with us and share a bit more with folks who are watching. So thank you for being here, and to folks out there in Facebook land, thank you for joining us. Keep an eye on the Elect Lori Trieger page for the schedule of some upcoming candidate coffees. Next week is Labor Day weekend, and we'll have a little special recorded something for you in honor of workers across Lane County and in our state and our country. So hope everybody is safe, healthy, wear your mask, keep your 6 feet distance, wash your hands, and take good care. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.